Okay, G, let's start the show.
Welcome to Questions and Alan, and here to answer your questions is Alan.
Hey everyone, I'm Alan Furstenberg, and I'm here to answer your questions and help you with designing and developing for the Google Assistant. So G, what's the word in the Twitterverse?
Giorgio Robino complimented you on an earlier show but asked you to clarify about scenes.
Since both Dialogflow and the Actions SDK version 2 are still valid, are scenes just a repaint of context-based Dialogflow Intents?
That's a great question, and thank you so much for asking it. So the first thing to understand is that what we're referring to these days as the Actions Builder or the current Actions SDK is the Actions on Google platform version 3. Now, the previous platform, Actions on Google version 2, is what we used to refer to as the Actions SDK, and it's what Dialogflow is built on top of. So no, there are actually two very different versions. Actions on Google version 3, the Actions Builder, the Actions SDK, isn't just built on top of Dialogflow, it's a complete different implementation of a very similar system. Now, they probably share some components. I don't have insight into exactly what Google is using, but we should be clear that it's not just built on top of Dialogflow. It's not just a rehash of the exact same thing. It's trying to do things in a very different way.
Okay, but are scenes just like contexts?
Scenes are similar to context, and there are certainly some parallels between the two, but there are big, big differences between them. The biggest one in my mind is that scenes are simpler to work with. They're also much more clear, so you know at any given time exactly what scene you're working on, what scene you're in, and exactly what you want to do in that scene. When you're working with Dialogflow contexts, it's not always clear what's the active context, how long that context is going to be alive, what you can do with it, and where you are in that entire process, and how they fit together. Scenes represent a more clear way to see how they fit together. I like to think of scenes as a state machine of sorts, so that you're moving from one state to another and you're clearly moving between these scenes. While this is something that you can do with context, I think it's a lot more difficult. It's a lot more difficult to manage that transition. It's not always clear when you have managed that transition, and it does make a whole bunch of things more difficult when you're using Dialogflow contexts.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. So the biggest example I usually come up with is, one of the things we get the most questions about, is that when you're working with follow-up intents in Dialogflow, it implements this using context. So it knows that when you've finished one, it sets the output context so that you go to the next stage in the follow-up conversation. So you have this possibility of a linear flow. The problem is people then ask questions like, well, how do I jump to a previous intent? Or, what happened? Why are my inputs still being confused between these two intents? And that's because of how the contexts are managed. So while you can do it, you need to do a lot more work to manage that context. Whereas in scenes, all you need to say is I'm transitioning from this scene to this scene to this scene to this scene, and as part of your linear flow. It's a lot easier to manage. And there are other similar things like that. Plus, there are a whole bunch of other advantages that we have when it comes to scenes.
What other advantages do scenes have?
Well, so for example, Dialogflow Intents, pretty much everything is packed in there. So if you're doing slot filling, it's in there. If you're doing event management, it's in there. Everything is part of a Dialogflow intent. Scenes break that up a little. So slot management and things along those nature can be done as part of a scene. Whereas detecting exactly what the user has said is more clearly isolated in an intent. This separation makes things a lot less confusing and easier to understand and manage. Now, admittedly, we do lose a little bit of power when we get away from the context model, but I think that's more than made up for because of the ease of use that we have with scenes that let us do many of the same things, just make us do it easier. Scenes, in my mind, just represent a much, much better approach to the solution. Well, there's a lot more I can talk about this, and I'm sure we're going to, but I think that's enough for now.
You can find examples at developers.google.com/assistant and ask us any other questions you may have. But till then, say goodnight, Alan.
Good night, Alan.